Give it here, I'll bang it under the tap.
Well, that's no good.
Chilled English pork loin chops, which have gone up by 3p.
If you're going to look and feel beautiful, you must eat properly.
Remember when a cart full of groceries didn't break the bank in the year you were born? Back then, the cost of milk, eggs, and meat shaped what ended up on your family's table and how often you got to eat your favorites. But as prices rose and habits shifted, what did we lose along the way without even noticing? In 1940, a gallon of milk cost just 52 cents. That might sound quaint now, but for families living through wartime rationing, milk was one of the few constants in a pantry that felt emptier by the week. Powdered alternatives existed, but they were chalky and bland. Fresh milk, when available, felt like a small luxury that still offered some normalcy with breakfast. Kids poured it over cornflakes, mothers stirred it into mashed potatoes, and fathers added it to coffee before long shifts at the plant. Refrigeration was limited, so milk had to be consumed quickly or not at all. Glass bottles clinked on porches in the early morning, often delivered by hand as part of a community route. If you missed a delivery, it might mean going without until the next week. Sometimes neighbors shared milk if someone ran out, especially in tight-knit warehousing blocks. That creamy white jug wasn't just food, it was a symbol that things were still functioning, at least a little. For all the fear and loss of the early 1940s, that glass of milk stayed sacred. You could buy it without coupons, for a while anyway, but prices climbed steadily as the war stretched on. And every uptick at the grocery store meant cutting back somewhere else. In 1940, a loaf of bread cost only 20 cents. You could stretch that into a week's worth of sandwiches, toast, or stuffing, maybe even bread pudding on Sunday if the ends weren't too stale. It was white, soft, and mass-produced, but it was comfort in every lunchbox. Bread sat at the heart of American tables, from school lunches to factory break rooms. Kids traded crusts for cookies, and mothers tucked thin slices of bologna between two pieces and called it a meal. It wasn't uncommon to see loaves baked at home, too, especially when flour was easier to come by than store-bought goods. Rationing pushed many families to get creative, grating stale bread for crumbs or stretching dough with oats or mashed potatoes. Even bread heels were saved for breadcrumbs or fried up in butter as a side dish. When ration coupons ran low, families leaned on bread to fill stomachs when meat or eggs weren't available. Every slice mattered, and waste was practically a sin in those war years. But even this basic staple saw creeping price hikes as wartime grain demands tightened. Those nickels and dimes added up fast. In 1945, a pound of chopped beef cost 27 cents. That same cut might have been just 16 cents a few years earlier. But everything changed when the war ended. Soldiers came home hungry, and meat was finally off ration. But that didn't mean it was suddenly cheap again. Grocery stores saw long lines as people scrambled to get their hands on beef that didn't need a coupon book. Ground beef was no longer just a war necessity. It became the base of meatloaf, chili, and hamburger dinners that brought families back together. The meat was often mixed with breadcrumbs, oatmeal, or rice just to stretch it further. Local butcher shops became gathering spots, where ration updates and availability news spread like wildfire. You'd plan your entire weekly meals around whether you scored a good cut of beef or not. Some families even traded backyard garden produce for extra rations or a butcher's favor. Even when beef returned to shelves, its scarcity during the war left a lasting sense that it was something special. The price was rising fast, and for many homes, even a small amount had to be stretched with breadcrumbs or oatmeal. You could taste celebration in that first post-war bite, but you could also taste just how fragile it all was. In 1945, eggs were 58 cents per dozen. That was nearly double what they cost just a few years earlier, and you could feel it every time you opened the icebox. Breakfast was never just breakfast in a post-war home. It was a symbol of stability. But with hens in shorter supply and demand surging from both soldiers and civilians, eggs became one of the most rationed and most missed items on grocery lists. Powdered substitutes made do, but they couldn't fry or poach like the real thing. Households reused shells as garden compost, and egg cartons were treated like treasures. If a neighbor's hens were laying, Bartering for a few fresh eggs could feel like winning the lottery. Eggs were stretched across meals. One egg might be whisked into an entire casserole or custard. Children often got first dibs on the freshest ones, while adults settled for powdered. For some families, a real fried egg on Sunday morning felt like the return of peace itself. When a fresh egg cracked in the pan again, it felt like a victory. But that carton came with a quiet price. You might skip meat that week just to afford it. In 1950, a can of Spam cost 25 cents. It was still the pantry champion in the aftermath of war, a salty, shelf-stable block that could be dinner in a pinch. Fried for breakfast, diced into casseroles, or layered on toast, Spam held a strange kind of charm. Families trusted it because it was familiar, affordable, and always there. The label didn't promise gourmet, but it did promise full bellies. It was often the first meat kids learned to cook with. Easy, safe, and hard to mess up. Recipes using Spam passed down like family secrets, from fried rice to mock ham loaf. Leftover slices were tucked into lunchboxes or reheated for breakfast, making one can stretch for days. Military veterans, used to eating Spam in mess halls, kept buying it out of habit and nostalgia. And while it wasn't glamorous, its reliability made it a staple in homes that still remembered wartime scarcity. Spam tasted like survival, and for many households still recovering financially, that meant something. It might not have been anyone's favorite meal, but it was often the only option, and that made it unforgettable. In 1950, milk hit 83 cents per gallon. That might seem like a small jump, but for families with growing kids, it changed everything. School lunch programs began emphasizing health and nutrition, and milk was front and center, thanks to heavy government promotion. But the more families leaned on it, the faster demand outpaced supply. Suddenly, milk wasn't the budget-friendly staple it once was. Advertisements painted milk as essential for strength and intelligence, putting pressure on parents to always have it in the fridge. Nutrition guidelines touted it as the key to building strong bones, especially for boys expected to grow into hard-working men. Glass bottles were still common, but the move toward mass production introduced new costs and new doubts about quality. For poorer families, stretching milk with water or skipping it altogether became part of the weekly struggle. Still, you'd rarely find a dinner table without at least one glass sitting beside a plate of meat and potatoes. You still bought it because what else could you pour into cereal or stir into macaroni and cheese? But the grocery bill always seemed a little steeper after you picked up that jug. In 1955, a dozen eggs cost 61 cents. You'd think prices would drop with the post-war boom, but the opposite happened. Even as factory farming scaled up, the appetite for eggs kept rising faster. They were breakfast, lunch, and dinner, scrambled, deviled, baked into cakes, or stirred into custards. Every American fridge had a carton, but refilling it each week meant cutting corners elsewhere. The television boom brought cooking shows into homes, and eggs became the go-to for almost any recipe. Families began to favor casseroles and bakes that relied on eggs for structure, not just nutrition. Some households swapped out meat for eggs a few nights a week just to keep costs manageable. Church cookbooks shared tips on using fewer eggs without ruining a dish, and some mothers became experts at it. And while the price crept up, eggs still felt like a safer spend than most other proteins. Kids might get one less candy bar, dads might skip the newspaper, and mothers, well, they learned to make 3 eggs feed a whole family again and again. In 1955, Spam rose to 39 cents a can. Still cheap, just not pocket change anymore. The war was over, but the economic grip of the previous decade lingered. Spam had moved from necessity to habit in many kitchens. People knew how to cook with it, make it stretch, make it taste good. But with rising wages and bigger grocery aisles, families started eyeing other options. Spam sandwiches turned into quick dinners for busy nights, but fresh meats were back in the spotlight. The canned aisle still got plenty of traffic, but now it had competition from butcher counters and freezer sections. You might keep a few cans tucked away, just in case, especially in rural towns where weather could isolate households. But Spam was no longer the hero of the meal. It was the fallback plan. Still, those who grew up with it kept a soft spot for its salty charm and simple prep. A few more cents could get you fresh meat, or at least a better cut. Spam stayed on the shelf, but now it was more for backup than center stage. In 1960, a pound of bacon cost 59 cents. That was the sizzle of the 60s, a time when breakfast came with flair and flavor. Cooking shows were booming, and so was home entertaining. Bacon meant you could serve brunch with pride, but it also meant your grocery list got heavier fast. You still bought it, of course. No one said no to bacon. Fashionable hosts used it to wrap cocktail weenies, garnish deviled eggs, or make stylish canapes. Magazines showcased glossy spreads of full breakfasts, eggs, toast, juice, and always, at least 2 strips of bacon. It became more than food. It was a performance, especially for suburban families eager to impress. Still, price-sensitive shoppers kept a watchful eye, buying in bulk or rationing strips like gold. Even with rising costs, bacon remained one of the few indulgences most weren't willing to give up. But sometimes, just sometimes, you stretched it thinner on the skillet. 1 slice per plate, not 2. In 1960, bread cost 45 cents a loaf. That was nearly double the price from 2 decades earlier, but most folks didn't notice. They were too busy packing lunches, making French toast, or tearing it up for stuffing. Bread still meant home, routine, and something warm in your hands after a long day. The wrapping was fancier now, with logos and freshness dates, but it was still the same soft staple that had seen families through wars and lean years. Loaves lined supermarket shelves, from enriched white to the first wave of wheat blends. School lunches often included peanut butter and jelly sandwiches on store-bought slices wrapped in wax paper. Mothers compared prices by the ounce, but the brand-name breads had already won their loyalty. Homemade bread was still around, but most families had traded time for convenience. And in a world shifting toward speed and efficiency, bread stayed remarkably consistent, a quiet companion in every meal. Just now, it came with a little less change in your pocket afterward. In 1965, a Swanson TV dinner cost 65 cents. That little foil tray divided into perfect squares of meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and corn was more than a shortcut. It was a promise. Pop it in the oven, wait 45 minutes, and dinner appeared. No apron or recipe required. It was the future of food, sold in frozen silence and eaten in front of the television. For working mothers and busy families, it felt like a lifeline. They let kids serve themselves while parents caught their breath after work. You could eat it on a tray table during Bonanza or the Ed Sullivan Show. No dining room required. It was the beginning of solo meals, of eating what you wanted, when you wanted it. It made cooking optional and gave families their evenings back. Sort of. And as other brands copied the formula, the frozen dinner aisle grew into a symbol of American modern life. No more peeling potatoes or timing roasts. You just needed electricity, an oven, and a little patience. The food was never quite fresh, never quite hot in the middle, but somehow it worked. And in a decade obsessed with convenience and modernity, it became iconic. That 65-cent box fed millions and quietly changed dinner forever. In 1965, milk cost $1.05 per gallon. That price tag marked more than inflation. It reflected a changing America. Industrial agriculture was scaling up. Dairies got bigger, colder, faster. But even as the supply grew, the cost to get milk from cow to kitchen rose too. Delivery men with clinking glass bottles slowly faded out of neighborhoods. Supermarkets now carried rows of plastic jugs, chilled under humming fluorescent lights. Pasteurization and homogenization became non-negotiable, raising quality, but also the cost. Nutrition campaigns began encouraging multiple servings a day, especially for kids, pushing demand higher. And even if you questioned the price, skipping milk never really felt like an option. Refrigeration, packaging, pasteurization, all those modern touches came with hidden costs. The gallon jug became the new standard, plastic replacing glass, convenience replacing doorstep delivery. But under that cap was the same drink mothers poured over cereal, and kids stirred into hot cocoa. That dollar felt like a new threshold, and for families living paycheck to paycheck, it added pressure. You still bought it because you had to, but you noticed the difference. In 1970, a dozen eggs cost 60 cents. It sounds reasonable now, but in a decade rattled by inflation and recession, even that felt like a stretch. Eggs were still the breakfast of champions, the cheap protein that scrambled its way into nearly every meal. But gas prices, wage stagnation, and the slow unraveling of post-war stability meant even grocery basics came with tough choices. Egg cartons got smaller or thinner, and expiration dates suddenly mattered more. Some households rationed them, saving eggs for baking and skipping fried breakfasts. Others tried powdered substitutes again, especially for large families. When money ran tight, eggs weren't wasted. They were measured. And each crack in the shell felt like something that needed to count. You cracked open an egg with care, maybe even split one across 2 dishes. Pancakes got thinner. Cakes used fewer yolks. You learned to stretch and substitute and make it work, because the grocery store no longer felt like a place of abundance. It was where your budget was tested. In 1970, bacon cost up to 95 cents per pound. It still sat in coolers, neatly stacked in thin plastic packs. But something had changed. That smoky, sizzling slice of Americana wasn't as casual anymore. It cost more, and you noticed. Families stopped cooking entire pans for breakfast. Instead, bacon became a treat, not a given. Breakfast for dinner nights became the compromise. A few slices served with pancakes once a week. Cheaper brands appeared, thinner and fattier, but they did the job. Cooks drained every drop of bacon grease into jars, saving it like gold for flavoring other meals. The sound and smell still filled the house, but it came with a side of guilt and budgeting. Even grocery ads stopped promoting bacon as everyday and began calling it weekend-worthy. A few pieces chopped into salad, crumbled into baked potatoes, or saved for Sundays. It wasn't just about flavor. It was about nostalgia. Bacon still meant home, but now it came with caution. A few extra cents felt heavier in wallets stretched by gas hikes and grocery inflation. You could still taste the comfort, but you counted every strip. In 1975, ground beef reached 99 cents per pound. For the first time, it flirted with the edge of $1 and crossed a mental line for millions of shoppers. Ground beef had always been the answer when money ran short. You could make meatloaf, tacos, stuffed peppers, anything hearty and filling. But by the mid-70s, that pound cost more than it felt like it should. Budget cookbooks began including meat extenders like rice, oats, and lentils. Shoppers flipped between store brands and sales, comparing fat content like stock prices. For some, meat became a weekend luxury, saved for burgers at a backyard grill. Home cooks stretched their skills, turning 1 pound into leftovers, then soup, then sandwiches. It was creativity born out of necessity, and it became the new normal. Cookbooks with titles like The Frugal Gourmet or Diet for a Small Planet started showing up in bookstores. People were asking serious questions about what went on their plates and how much they were willing to pay for it. Beans, lentils, and tofu slowly crept into casseroles once ruled by beef. The meat didn't disappear, but the culture around it started to shift. That price tag made it clear. Even everyday meat was no longer simple. In 1980, bacon hit $1.39 per half pound. Do the math, and you're staring down almost $3 a pound, a jump that scorched the grocery budget. It was still the smell of weekend mornings, of mom at the stove, of kids wandering in hungry and half asleep. But fewer people were frying up full packages anymore. It became garnish, accent, seasoning. Restaurants scaled back portions, diners substituted sausage, and home cooks turned to turkey bacon just to make ends meet. Bacon grease jars that once sat proudly by the stove disappeared from kitchens trying to cut fat. Commercials promised leaner, lighter breakfasts, often without a single slice, and yet the craving never left. Bacon became less about quantity and more about ritual, one perfect salty bite to remember how it used to be. One strip, maybe 2, crumbled on a salad or wrapped around a baked date. The shift wasn't just economic, it was generational. Fat was suddenly the enemy. Diet books lined kitchen counters, and breakfast lost its grease. But even as hearts and waistlines tightened, people still longed for that one indulgent crisp. Bacon might have cost more, but it never lost its hold. In 1980, tuna cost 99 cents a can. That marked the end of cheap convenience, the era when you could stock your pantry with protein for pennies. Tuna salad sandwiches were a school lunch staple mixed with mayonnaise and maybe some chopped celery. It was the working-class answer to deli meats and the midweek meal that needed no stove. But canned tuna wasn't just about lunch. It was a symbol of something greater, how modern food made life easier. Now it came with BPA warnings and mercury charts, and nutrition labels were suddenly front and center. Brands started boasting dolphin safe catches and wild-caught certifications, transforming a humble can into a political choice. Recipes once pulled from church cookbooks were swapped for online blogs suggesting quinoa and avocado upgrades. But even dressed up or dressed down, it remained a pantry go-to for anyone watching their wallet. The value may have changed, but the comfort stayed in every flaky bite, and now it cost almost $1. That changed things. Shoppers started skipping it or buying less or turning to cheaper alternatives. Tuna casserole no longer felt like a bargain, it felt like a splurge wrapped in foil. In 1985, artisan bread was rising, but store bread stayed at 99 cents. That moment told two stories at once. On one shelf, sourdough boules with crusty edges sat in paper bags with fancy fonts. On another, the old standby, white, sliced, soft, and sealed in plastic, held its ground. Supermarkets were changing, and so were the shoppers. Some families reached for rosemary focaccia. Others stuck with the same sandwich bread they had trusted for decades. Grocery carts told quiet stories of income, preference, and the comfort of routine. While some explored bakeries and farmers markets, others still relied on buy one get one deals at chain stores. Bread wasn't just bread anymore, it was a lifestyle signal. And for the price of 99 cents, that plastic-wrapped loaf still promised familiarity in a rapidly changing world. Toast, grilled cheese, peanut butter, and jelly, none of it needed an artisan crust to feel like home. That divide wasn't just about taste, it was about identity, income, and access. One loaf said comfort, the other whispered status. And even if you only had 99 cents, you still left the store with something warm to put on the table. In 1985, ground beef cost $1.47 per pound. The price had climbed slowly, but by now it felt almost normal. The sticker shock of the 70s had faded into routine. Ground beef was still in rotation. Hamburgers on weekends, spaghetti sauce midweek, chili when the weather turned cold. But now it shared space with newer ideas. Health food stores were expanding. Tofu was no longer taboo. Some folks cut their beef with mushrooms or oats. Others skipped it entirely. Cooks started experimenting with lightened-up versions of their favorites, swapping out half the beef to stretch both calories and cash. Meatloaf turned into veggie loaf hybrids, and tacos often came with more beans than beef. Still, nothing quite replaced the taste of the real thing when it was seasoned just right. Even at a higher price, that 1-pound pack held power, tradition, flavor, and flexibility. And in kitchens across America, it remained the one ingredient that made a meal feel complete. Still, that pound of ground beef carried comfort. You could stretch it, you could season it, and most of all, you could count on it to feed everyone. In 1990, a gallon of milk cost $2.78. That was no small jump from the $1 days of the 1960s. But by 1990, people were paying for more than just the liquid. They were buying safety, pasteurization, homogenization, and a growing awareness of hormones and antibiotics. They were paying for packaging, cartons, jugs, and labels promising vitamins and fat percentages. Milk was still a must-have, but now it came with options: whole, 2%, skim, organic. Convenience stores carried it for a premium, and big box stores sold it by the case. Nutrition guidelines shifted again, urging families to go low-fat or fat-free. Glass bottles disappeared almost entirely, replaced by plastic jugs and cardboard boxes. Soy and rice milk made their first big splash into grocery coolers, hinting at a future of dairy alternatives. Coupons became gold, and shoppers clipped them religiously to ease the sting of rising prices. Still, the jug made it home, because no kitchen felt right without milk on the shelf. It was no longer just a drink, it was a decision. And every decision at the grocery store came with a price. In 1995, bread cost just 89 cents a loaf. At first glance, it looked like a deal. Less than $1 for a food that filled your pantry, your plate, and your stomach. But under that price tag was a quiet shift happening in how Americans ate. Low-fat diets were everywhere. Supermarkets lined their aisles with rice cakes and Snackwell cookies. Bread, especially the white, spongy kind, was getting a bad rap. But still, it stayed. You needed it for peanut butter sandwiches, grilled cheese, French toast on the weekends. Even if carbs were becoming controversial, bread still sat in almost every shopping cart. It was dependable, familiar, a symbol of how the past still clung to the future. Parents grabbed whole wheat for the fiber. Kids still asked for the kind that squished between their fingers. And at 89 cents, it was one of the few things that still felt affordable. You could make 10 sandwiches, maybe 12 if you were careful. You could tear it into soup, toast it for breakfast, or snack on it plain at midnight. The rise of gluten-free diets and boutique bakeries hadn't arrived yet, not in full force. And so, despite the health headlines and trendy food magazines, this humble loaf held the line. It fed children, comforted college students, and softened the blow of tight grocery budgets. Not every food survived the diet wars, but bread kept showing up, quiet, cheap, and always just good enough. In 1995, ground beef hovered at $1.49 per pound, just under the price spike that had turned heads a decade earlier, but still high enough to make shoppers pause. This was the era when Taco Tuesday became more than a trend. It was a budget-friendly ritual. Ground beef made it possible. You could feed a family of 5 with a single skillet, some seasoning, and a stack of tortillas. It stretched easily. It browned fast. And no one complained when it hit the table. But something else was happening too. The words organic and grass-fed started to slip into recipes and store signage. Ground beef wasn't just beef anymore. It had labels, grades, branding. Some folks stuck to the cheapest pack in the fridge. Others began asking where their meat came from and how it was raised. But most were still just trying to make ends meet. $1.49 didn't seem bad for a dinner that could last 2 nights. Hamburger Helper was still king in many kitchens, and cookbooks with hearty, humble meals stayed on the shelf. Ground beef was the workhorse. It knew its role. It didn't ask for praise. It just kept dinners going, week after week. You could still make chili, meatballs, or a cottage pie without spending half your paycheck. And for families trying to stretch every dollar, that mattered more than any organic label ever could. In 2000, eggs cost 96 cents per dozen, just shy of $1 and just in time to mark a new century. The world was buzzing with talk of technology, the internet, and Y2K fears. But at the grocery store, some things still felt familiar. Eggs were still cracked into mixing bowls, sizzled in pans, and packed into school lunches with a side of salt and pepper. They were an everyman food, high in protein, low in cost, and endlessly versatile. Deviled, scrambled, poached, hard-boiled, take your pick. And for under $1, they could be all of those things in a single week. While fad diets surged and vanished, Atkins, South Beach, Zone, eggs managed to land on all of them. One week they were good, the next week cholesterol villains. But the price stayed steady and people kept buying. They had to. Whether you were a college student trying to bulk up or a mom making breakfast for 3 kids before school, eggs delivered. And unlike meats or dairy, they didn't feel risky. They were fast, portable, and quietly nutritious. At under $1, they were still accessible to almost everyone. You could walk into a gas station mini-mart, a corner bodega, or a big box store and walk out with a dozen. That made them powerful. They weren't flashy, they weren't trendy, but they were steady. And in a world spinning toward rapid change, that counted for something. In 2005, milk cost $3.20 per gallon. It was a steep climb from the days of $1 jugs, and families felt the squeeze. This wasn't just a shift in inflation. It was a reflection of a new food culture. The low-carb craze was in full swing. Protein was king. Suddenly, milk wasn't just something you poured over cereal, it was part of a meal plan. It had to be 2%, or whole, or skim, or better yet, organic. Parents debated hormone-free cartons in the dairy aisle. Ads warned about antibiotics. And alongside all that came the slow but steady rise of dairy alternatives. Soy milk, almond milk, rice milk. Each one a little more expensive, a little more complicated. But regular milk? It still had its place. School cafeterias still poured it. Dietitians still recommended it. Toddlers still clutched sippy cups full of it. But the price tag hit harder now. At over $3, it was no longer an afterthought. Some families cut back, some watered it down, others made the switch to bulk buying or discount brands. But everyone noticed. That gallon of milk, once a symbol of American abundance, now sat as a quiet indicator of shifting times. You still needed it, you still bought it, but now you thought twice before pouring too much down the drain. Today, ground beef costs $6.29 per pound. That number lands like a punch. It's not just a price, it's a reminder of how far we've come and what it costs to keep up. 80 years ago, you could buy 3 pounds of beef for under $1. Now 1 pound costs more than a full meal used to. For many families, it's no longer a default purchase. It's a decision. Do we get the beef or something cheaper, something easier, something plant-based? Ground beef used to be the safety net, the fallback, the sure thing. Now it's on the chopping block, literally and financially. People still love burgers, of course, still crave meatballs and shepherd's pie, but $6.29 for 1 pound? That changes things. You think twice before tossing it in your cart. You check the label, lean or regular, grass-fed or grain-finished, and sometimes you put it back. It's not just about cost, it's about value. What does $6 get you now? A meal? 2? Less? The pandemic, supply chain issues, labor shortages, all of it pushed food prices up, and ground beef, the staple of staples, became proof. Proof that grocery shopping is no longer predictable. That meat is no longer guaranteed. That dinner costs more than it used to, and maybe more than it should. Bacon used to be a Sunday treat, a crisp slice or two beside scrambled eggs and toast. It was greasy, smoky, salty magic, and affordable enough that you could throw it in a sandwich or wrap it around meatloaf without blinking. You bought a pack, you cooked half, and you ate the rest cold out of the fridge when no one was looking. That was the bacon tax. But these days, bacon is practically a luxury meat. A pack that used to cost $2 is now pushing $8 or even $10, and that is for the regular stuff, not the thick-cut, hickory-smoked artisan strips wrapped in gold foil. Grocery shoppers do double takes. Sales on bacon feel like Black Friday. People swap brands, skip it entirely, or portion it like rationed butter in wartime. You can almost hear the sizzling sound in the skillet crying over how much it cost to get there. Still, some refuse to give it up. Because bacon does not just taste good. It feels like something good. It feels like breakfast at home. It feels like comfort. You might buy less, use it slower, or save it for special meals. But deep down, you still crave it. And even at those prices, bacon still sells out. Now this one hurt the most because it was not even a toy. Not yet. The Star Wars Early Bird Certificate package came out before the actual action figures did. Rich kids got a fancy envelope in the mail with a promise inside. A cardboard stand, some stickers, and a little certificate saying their figures were coming soon. That was the flex. You were not just playing with Star Wars. You were ahead of it. And if you were not in the know, it made you feel like you missed a secret meeting. This was 1977, right after A New Hope changed everything and toys were flying off shelves. Except these toys, they were not even on shelves yet. You had to pre-order. You had to believe. And most families were not dropping extra money on toys that did not even exist yet. It was not just about owning the figures. It was about being part of the moment before the moment. These kids had the bragging rights of being first, even before anything arrived in the mail. That little cardboard stand on their dresser said, "We knew before you did." But the ones who did? Their kids strutted into school holding that display stand like it was the Holy Grail. They knew something you did not. Their action figures showed up in the spring, 4 little plastic legends: Luke, Leia, Chewbacca, and R2D2. And you just stood there, trying not to care. But it was obvious. They had it. You did not. And you would never forget it. Canned pork and beans were a meal, a side dish, and a backup plan all in one. You bought them by the case, stacked the cans in the pantry, and knew you were covered for at least a week. They were soft, sweet, and strangely satisfying. Thick sauce, tender beans, and tiny bits of pork if you got lucky. Sometimes it was 1 chunk of pork per can, but it made you feel like it counted. You heated them on the stove or ate them cold when time or patience ran out. Served over toast, beside hot dogs, or just in a bowl with a spoon, they got the job done. You could dress them up or leave them as they were. Either way, they filled you up. They stuck to your ribs and stained your plate, but you cleaned it with a piece of bread. There were no rules about how to serve them, just instincts and whatever else was on hand. Sometimes you added mustard or onions, trying to change things up. Other times, you were too hungry to bother. Kids ate them without question. Adults relied on them without pride. The label was always familiar, even when the brand changed. They were warm, they were cheap, they were always there. Nobody called it fancy, but nobody went hungry either. In a time when grocery bills had to stretch, this little can was one of the best returns on $1 you could ask for. Pork and beans were the taste of getting through it, and somehow they stuck around because they worked. The smoky pool hall was absolutely, positively not for kids, except for the one time Dad brought you and said, "Just this once." The room smelled like cigars, old felt, and secrets. Neon beer signs buzzed faintly, casting colored light across rows of tables where grown men hunched like philosophers over green cloth. Dad walked in like he owned the place. A couple of the regulars nodded his way, and one said, "Got the kid today, huh?" Dad just grinned. He set up at table 3, his lucky one, and handed you a cue that was a little too tall. "Always chalk it first," he said, demonstrating like he was passing down a family recipe. You took the shot. It was terrible. He applauded anyway. Dad sank a tricky bank shot and winked. "Still got it," he said. You wanted to believe he never lost it. No prizes, no points, just the sound of laughter echoing through smoke and sawdust. And when you stepped outside, your shirt smelled like the pool hall for the rest of the day. But the best part? That memory was yours forever. And next up, we are heading someplace even stranger, where camo jackets and canteens turned kids into explorers. Chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, and aerosol sprays were in everything from your mom's hairspray to your dad's deodorant. And back then, nobody thought twice about it. You'd hold the can, press the nozzle, and hear that satisfying pshht as a cloud of product filled the bathroom like a fog machine. It was all part of the routine: style, spray, suffocate. The scent lingered, the mist settled, and somewhere high above the earth, the ozone layer took another hit. CFCs were hailed as miracle propellants, but they were also silent saboteurs, breaking down ozone molecules and letting ultraviolet radiation pour in. It wasn't until scientists noticed a literal hole forming over Antarctica that the alarm bells rang, and suddenly the hairspray that made your bangs defy gravity didn't seem so harmless anymore. By the late 1980s, global treaties stepped in, banning or phasing out CFCs in favor of safer alternatives. Today's aerosol cans may still mist, but they don't punch holes in the sky. Still, if we're talking about scents that stuck around, sometimes in your nostrils, sometimes in your brain, the next culprit was in your pencil box. Peanut butter was never just food, it was a backup plan. A peanut butter sandwich meant you could get through a school day or a late shift without cooking. You could spoon it straight from the jar, smear it on apples, or dip pretzels in it for a quick hit of salty sweet comfort. Jif, Skippy, or the crunchy store brand, you had choices, and they were all cheap. It was the first thing kids learned how to cook. It was the last thing in the cabinet before payday. It was protein when meat was too expensive and comfort when everything else felt too hard. It never needed heating, slicing, or planning. Just a spoon. And for a lot of us, it was the taste of survival with a little sugar on top. Today, one jar costs what two used to, sometimes more. The aisle has turned into a display of inflation, with jars climbing over $6, even higher for natural or non-GMO versions. You hold the jar and think, is it really worth it? And the answer is usually yes, because peanut butter still does everything. It still feeds kids. It still lives in lunchboxes and emergency kits. But now, it comes with a mental negotiation. You might skip jelly, you might spoon it slower, but you still buy it. Because peanut butter is still the one food that never let you down. It is just a little harder to afford that loyalty now. The Lite-Brite itself was already a showstopper. Plug it in, stick colored pegs into a black screen, and watch your artwork light up. But here is the kicker. Most kids only had the basic set. Rich kids had the extra refill packs. That meant more templates, more colors, more options. Unicorns, rocket ships, zoo animals, you name it. The refill packs were not cheap. You had to buy them separately, and once they were used, that was it. No do-overs. They had enough pegs to make a Lite-Brite zoo, a Lite-Brite city, a Lite-Brite universe. Their templates were rotated weekly, like gallery installations. Meanwhile, your set still had two missing red pegs and a sun that was mostly blue. So most of us rationed them like gold. One template per month maybe. But if your family had money, you went through them like printer paper. You would visit a friend's house and see 10 finished Lite-Brite templates pinned to their bedroom wall, full gallery mode. And meanwhile, yours still had that same flower pattern you made 6 months ago. But even if you did not have the extras, you still loved the idea. There was something special about watching your design light up in the dark, even if it was the same one every time. Economy-size bags of popcorn kernels were the go-to snack when the cupboard was looking thin. One giant bag could last for weeks, maybe longer. You popped it in oil on the stove, no microwave, no fancy machines, just a pot, a lid, and the sound of hope. The kernels jumped, hissed, and turned into fluffy handfuls of salty comfort. Sometimes you burned the bottom layer, sometimes you nailed it. You salted it heavy, added a little margarine if you had it, and served it up in bowls or paper bags. It was movie night food, after-school food, or just something to fill the gap between meals. You made it by feel, counting the seconds between pops with your ear to the lid. You knew just how much oil to use, even without a measuring spoon. Sometimes you added sugar and made kettle corn before you even knew what kettle corn was. It fed a whole group of kids for the cost of one box of cereal. Even the unpopped kernels were kept, just in case you could try again. You burned your fingers more than once reaching into the pot too soon. The smell filled the house and drew people in like magic. And somehow that bag always lasted longer than you thought it would. It cost less than $1, and somehow it felt like a treat. Popcorn kernels were proof that something simple could still feel special. Woolco was supposed to be the next evolution of Woolworths. It had the size of a department store and the soul of a 5 and dime. Launched in the 1960s and booming into the 1970s, Woolco promised everything in one place: clothes, toys, appliances, groceries. For families used to making a dozen different stops, it felt like magic. A bright red sign that said you could get it all without going broke. But behind that promise was chaos. Poor inventory systems, outdated layouts, stores too big to manage and too cluttered to navigate. And then came the competition. Kmart, Target, Walmart. Retail giants with cleaner shelves, sharper prices, and better supply chains. Woolco could not keep up. It became the store you only visited when you had to. The store where the lights buzzed too loud and the shelves were always half empty. By the 1980s, most Woolcos had either been shut down or sold off. Some were turned into malls, others just disappeared. And with them went a small piece of how we used to shop. wandering the aisles on Saturday mornings, dreaming about toys, picking out socks with Mom. Woolco was not perfect, but it was familiar, and we miss it more than we admit. High Karate aftershave was a joke and a phenomenon all at once. It came in a cheap bottle with a commercial that turned masculinity into a parody of itself. Spray this on, and women would attack you. Literally. The ads were absurd, over the top, and completely unforgettable. But behind the humor was a surprisingly decent scent. High Karate became the go-to for teenage boys trying to smell grown-up and grown men trying to stay playful. It was the cologne you found in your dad's drawer next to the tie clips and old movie stubs. But the joke wore thin. Trends shifted. The 1980s wanted power and polish, not camp and chaos. High Karate was quietly discontinued. Stores stopped stocking it. The bottles became rare. Today, it is a punchline for some and a scent memory for others. A whiff of what it meant to be young, to be bold, to believe that a fragrance could change everything. Store-brand white bread was the simplest thing in the cart. $1 or less, soft enough to squish, bland enough to go with everything. It was peanut butter's best friend, the base for grilled cheese, French toast, and budget BLTs. It tore easily, went stale quickly, but no one cared. It did its job. It was there for bologna and mayonnaise, for butter and cinnamon sugar, for ketchup sandwiches when that was all you had. You could roll it into dough balls, toast it black, or eat it plain during long grocery weeks. It was the lunch you did not pack with pride, but it filled you up. Bread was not about taste, it was about being full. Now that $1 loaf is pushing $2, sometimes $3, and if you want anything beyond plain white, like wheat or multigrain, it climbs even faster. Bread is not supposed to be the item you debate over, but you stand there now looking at unit prices like you are shopping for real estate. And somehow, even the cheap bread has gotten smaller. The slices are thinner, the bags lighter, but the price tags heavier. Still, you need it. Still, it goes in the cart. Because white bread is not just a side, it is the foundation of half your meals. And whether it is 99 cents or $2.99, it is still the bread that holds it all together. Every time you saw it in a catalog, it looked like joy in a box. A bright red roof, that big white dog on top, and a little hand crank that promised a mountain of shaved ice on a hot summer day. The Snoopy snow cone machine was not just a toy, it was an event. And if you had it, you threw the kind of parties that kids remembered. It came with little paper cups, tiny flavor packets, and a scoop shaped like Snoopy's head. Everything about it screamed deluxe. But the truth? That thing barely worked. The crank was stiff, the ice melted fast, and the syrup ran out in 5 minutes. And still, everyone wanted it. It was sticky, messy, and almost always disappointing, and yet no one cared. The act of making the snow cone mattered more than eating it. The kid who had it was the one who got to stand behind the counter, smiling like a carnival vendor. You wanted it, because it meant your family could afford fun. It meant you had a kitchen big enough for a snow cone stand and parents who did not mind the mess. It was never about the taste. It was about showing off. The kid who had it only made snow cones a few times a year, but you would never forget watching them do it. You stood in line behind 6 other kids just to get a watered-down cherry slush in a cup half the size of your palm. But that did not matter. You were part of it for 5 minutes, and then it was over. The miniature golf course with homemade obstacles was never part of a chain. It was part of someone's backyard that got out of hand. The fence leaned, the AstroTurf peeled at the corners, and the scorecards were photocopies from sometime around 1967. But to Dad, this was sacred ground. "Watch out for the windmill," he would say, pointing to a lopsided contraption that spun more out of habit than engineering. Hole 6 had a dinosaur, once green, now a sad grayish blue with a missing eye, and hole 9 was uphill into what looked like a mailbox from a sci-fi movie. Dad kept score with one of those tiny pencils, sometimes generous, sometimes forgetting that penalty stroke. He cheered every shot like you had just qualified for a Masters tournament, and when he sunk a hole in one, he would raise his hands like he had won a trophy. The best part? Ice cream sandwiches at the end, slightly melted from the cooler behind the counter. You never asked for anything more. But if the ground game was that magical, just wait until you went airborne, watching planes take off from a sleepy little airport that felt like your own private runway. Leaded gasoline was the scent of every gas station and the invisible cloud trailing every school bus. It made cars run smoother and engines knock less, so people thought it was a miracle fuel. You'd roll down the windows, sit in the back seat without a seatbelt, and breathe it all in like it was part of the road trip experience. Kids pumped gas. Adults wiped their hands with a rag and got right back behind the wheel. The lead helped your engine, but it quietly poisoned everything else: air, soil, and especially young brains. Over time, researchers found links between lead exposure and learning disabilities, developmental delays, and even violent behavior later in life. But in the 1970s, it was standard. Unleaded options only started to pop up near the end of the decade, and most people ignored them. Gas smelled strong. It meant power. It meant you were going somewhere. Nobody questioned it. Until the studies started piling up and regulations followed. Leaded gas was phased out over time and officially banned in the United States in 1996, long after many of us had already filled our lungs with it. But if gasoline filled the air, the very buildings we lived in were just as dangerous and hiding something even harder to see. Eggs used to be a default, always in the fridge, always in the budget. You could grab a dozen for less than $1 in the 1980s, and even into the early 2000s they felt affordable. They were breakfast, they were dinner, they were dessert, scrambled, fried, baked into cakes, or boiled for sandwiches. No one really thought about the price of eggs because they were just there. They were dependable. Now, not so much. Prices have doubled, even tripled, depending on the year and your zip code. It is not unheard of to pay $6 or $7 for a dozen, and that is not even the organic kind. Suddenly, eggs are the kind of item you compare per unit, per store, and per brand. That cheap protein? Not so cheap anymore. You stand in the dairy aisle doing mental math and wondering how something so basic got so expensive, and yet you still buy them. Because you have to. Because they do everything. They are glue for baking, power for breakfast, and comfort in a pan. There was a time when eggs were what you added to stretch the budget. Now they are the thing that might break it. It looked like something from a spaceship. The Polaroid SX70 was the first folding instant camera, and when you saw someone snap a photo and watch it develop in seconds, it felt like magic. Rich kids did not just take pictures, they made memories on demand. You had to pay for the camera and the film, which came in little packs that were just as expensive as the camera itself. Most families did not mess with that. Too pricey, too fragile, too much of a risk. But for the kids who had one, it was a golden ticket to popularity. At birthday parties, school trips, sleepovers, you knew who had the camera. They would pass the picture around as it faded into life. Everyone would huddle around like it was a crystal ball. And even if the photo came out blurry, it still felt special. Because you could hold it. You could pin it to a wall or tuck it into a notebook. It was proof that you were there. That moment belonged to you. Unless, of course, you were just standing on the edge of the photo, half in, half forgotten. Frozen pie crust discs were your shortcut to something that felt homemade. They came stacked in twos, separated by paper, and wrapped in waxy plastic. You let them thaw on the counter and prayed they did not crack. Filled with canned fruit or leftover meat, they turned into dessert or dinner depending on the day. You pinched the edges, brushed the tops with a little milk, and baked until golden brown. They were flaky enough, forgiving enough, and always appreciated. You rolled them thinner if you needed to stretch them. If one tore, you patched it with your fingers and kept going. Sometimes they stuck to the pan, and you served them anyway. The smell of them baking made the house feel warmer, even in the middle of summer. No one asked if it came from scratch. They just said, "Thank you." Nobody cared that it came from the freezer. They cared that you made something with it. They saved you time, saved you ingredients, and gave you something to serve with pride. Frozen pie crusts were not homemade, but they still came from a place of care. The Oddball Roadside Museum was where logic went to take a nap. You saw the hand-painted sign from the highway. Come see the world's largest pencil, or America's first toaster, still works. Dad would swerve into the gravel lot like it was destiny. Admission was cheap, $3 cash only, and worth every penny. The inside was a fever dream. Display cases filled with bottle caps from all 50 states. A whole wall dedicated to vintage shampoo bottles. A two-headed taxidermy calf that haunted your dreams for a week. "You brought the kid today, huh?" he would say, as if Dad came here weekly. You followed them through rooms of strange collections while Dad laughed and read every single placard out loud. It was like watching a kid in a candy store, only the candy was lawn darts, Pez dispensers, and World War II ration kits. "Now this," Dad would say, holding up a glass jar with something floating in it. "This is history." And even though you rolled your eyes, part of you agreed. But if you really want to feel history in motion, just wait until you join him by the old train tracks, watching boxcars roll by, counting like your life depended on it. Burger Chef once had more locations than McDonald's. That is the part people forget. Before the Golden Arches took over every highway exit and downtown corner, Burger Chef was America's fast food sweetheart. Its secret? The Fun Meal, a direct precursor to the Happy Meal. It gave kids toys, games, and branded packaging years before anyone else did. The burgers were solid, the prices were right, and families loved it. But then came the lawsuits, the missteps, the slow bleed of bad business decisions. Hardee's bought them out, closed down locations, and erased the name almost overnight. Some buildings stayed standing for years, sun-faded signs above cracked pavement. You would drive past them and remember the taste, the toy, the tray that made you feel like the meal was yours. What happened to Burger Chef was not just corporate takeover, it was theft by attrition, a slow-motion forgetting of something that once mattered. Ask anyone over 50 if they remember it, and their eyes light up. But there are no new stories being made. No drive-thrus, no jingles, no future, just memories. And that, for a brand that once brought so much joy, feels like a tragedy no one saw coming. Macaroni and cheese in a box was the go-to. It was dinner when you had $3 left, when the fridge was empty, or when you just could not deal with cooking. It was fluorescent orange, creamy if you stirred it right, and ready in 10 minutes. Every kid loved it. Every college student lived on it. You did not need measuring cups, timers, or even much skill. Just a pot, a spoon, and enough water to boil. It made everyone feel like they knew how to cook, even if it came from a box. Leftovers barely existed because no one ever left any. And sometimes the cheese powder was the only bright thing in the kitchen. You could get a box for 30 cents, sometimes less. Now, that same box is creeping past $1 or more. And the deluxe kinds, the ones with real cheese sauce? Forget it. The value meal just got a markup. And that stings because boxed mac and cheese was supposed to be inflation-proof. It was never about gourmet. It was about survival. Now it is in a weird middle zone. Still cheap, but not cheap enough to ignore. Not when you used to buy 5 boxes for the price of 1. And yet it still sits in the pantry. Still shows up when you need it most. Mac and cheese in a box used to be your fallback. Now it is more like your compromise. You could hear it before you saw it. That low rattle of gears and rubber on pavement. When a Raleigh Chopper rolled by, every other bike might as well have disappeared. It had high-rise handlebars, a banana seat, and a frame that looked like it belonged in a motorcycle gang, not the school bike rack. And the kid riding it? Always a rich kid. Always. They would glide past you like they were in a magazine ad, not even pedaling half the time. That gear shifter in the middle of the frame looked like it was built for a race car. You had never even seen a gear shifter on a bike before. Yours probably came from the back of a hardware store. This thing looked imported from the future. And let us be honest, those bikes were not cheap. Parents who bought them were not just giving their kid a ride. They were buying attention, pride, and a neon-colored way to stand out. You tried not to care? You told yourself your bike got the job done. But deep down, watching them speed off with one hand on the bars and the other holding a can of soda, it burned. That chopper was not just a bicycle. It was a moving billboard that said, "My parents can afford it, yours cannot." If these grocery prices brought back memories or made your jaw drop, tell us what your family bought most. Tap like if you felt the nostalgia and subscribe so you never miss a bite of the past.